There is a book written over 500 years ago that remains the most dangerous and honest book about power ever written. It is a book that was found on Napoleon's shelf, its margins filled with his notes, and by Hitler's bedside. It was read by Stalin, Mussolini, and every ruthless corporate raider and political schemer of the 21st century. A book so venomous, so cynical, that for centuries it was banned by popes, burned in public squares by Protestant pastors, and its author condemned as a servant of the devil and a teacher of evil. This book teaches that lying in politics is not a vice, but a necessary tool, that cruelty, applied decisively and at the right time, is a virtue, that it is much safer for a ruler to be feared than loved, for love is fickle, while fear is constant, and that the great goal, preserving and strengthening the state, justifies any and all means. The name of this book is The Prince. The name of its author is Niccolò Machiavelli. But what if I told you that this entire story is only half the truth? That perhaps the author of the most cynical book in history was in fact a passionate patriot and a staunch Republican? That the man whose name became synonymous with tyranny spent his entire adult life fighting for the freedom and prosperity of his homeland? That he was subjected to brutal torture on the rack for his devotion to his ideals? And that he wrote his most famous and terrifying book not in a lavish palace, but in utter desperation, while in exile, as a final, desperate attempt to return to the world of high politics and serve the state once more. This is not just a story about a man. It is a story about the darkest and most alluring mystery of power. To unravel it, we must embark on a journey to the very heart of the Italian Renaissance, to a city that was both the cradle of the greatest art and a bloody serpent's nest of politics, to a city named Florence. Florence at the end of the 15th century, where Niccolò Machiavelli was born in 1469, was not a tourist postcard, but a boiling cauldron. It was a city-state torn apart by endless, fierce struggles. Here, noble families like the Pazzi and the Medici slaughtered each other right in the middle of church services. Here, bankers ruled as uncrowned kings, and mercenary armies, the condottieri, cynical professional soldiers, sold their loyalty to the highest bidder and could betray their employer in the heat of battle. Here, charismatic preachers like the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola burned priceless paintings by Botticelli, books by Petrarch, and the mirrors of Florentine beauties in giant quote, only to be burned at the stake themselves in the very same square a few years later. And looming over this bloody, chaotic scene were the shadows of giant predators, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, which, like wolves, circled the rich, brilliant, but fatally disunited Italy, preparing to tear it to pieces. This was the world Niccolò was born into. He was neither an aristocrat from the Medici family nor a wealthy merchant from the Wool Guild. His father, Bernardo, was a doctor of law from an ancient but impoverished Tuscan family. The Machiavellis barely made ends meet. They owned an old house in the city and a small, unprofitable farm in the village of Sant'Andrea in Percussina, which consumed more money than it produced. But they possessed something more valuable than money: books and education. Bernardo was a passionate humanist, a man of the new era who believed in the power of human reason and classical wisdom. He gave his son the best education he could afford. From a young age, Niccolò devoured the works of the ancient Romans, the history of Livy, the treatises of Cicero, the Annals of Tacitus. He was not just studying a dry list of dates, wars, and conspiracies. Like a future engineer, he was studying the mechanics of power. He saw how empires rose and fell, how heroes became tyrants, and how republics turned into dictatorships. For him, the ancient world was not a dead past, but a vast, endless laboratory in which every possible political experiment had already been conducted. He grew up a quiet, unassuming, but incredibly observant young man, with a mind as sharp as a scalpel, and a biting, sarcastic sense of humor that he hid behind a mask of modesty. He witnessed the entire carousel of Florentine politics with his own eyes. He saw his city first ruled absolutely by the Medici banking family led by Lorenzo the Magnificent, who turned Florence into the cultural capital of the world. Then he watched as, after Lorenzo's death, his inept son was exiled, and power in the city was seized by the charismatic and fanatical friar Savonarola, who established a theocratic dictatorship of, and then, just 4 years later, he saw the same Florentines, tired of austerity and fiery sermons, gleefully hang and burn Savonarola himself in the Piazza della Signoria. He absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He saw that popular love is fickle, that power based solely on moral authority is fragile, and that yesterday's idol could easily end up on the scaffold today. In this atmosphere of chaos and change, in 1498, after the execution of Savonarola, the Republic was restored in Florence, and 29-year-old Niccolò Machiavelli, an unknown young man with no wealth or influential patrons, miraculously secured a crucial government post. He was appointed Secretary of the Second Chancery, and shortly thereafter also Secretary to the Council of Ten, the body responsible for military and foreign affairs. It was a dizzying, almost inexplicable rise. Overnight, the quiet bookworm found himself at the epicenter of European high politics. He was not a minister or a ruler. In modern terms, he was a high-ranking civil servant, the head of an administration responsible for diplomatic correspondence, maintaining secret archives, and organizing embassies. But this position gave him a unique, priceless opportunity. He did not make the final decisions, but he prepared the ground for them, analyzing information and advising the ruling signoria. He was the eyes, ears, and, to a large extent, the brain of the Florentine Republic. For the next 14 years, he would serve his homeland tirelessly. His work became his passion, his life. He undertook more than 20 diplomatic missions to the courts of the most powerful rulers of his time. He negotiated with King Louis XII of France, with Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, and with the warrior Pope Julius II. He saw the underbelly of power, its dirty, bloody mechanisms, which the noble ancient historians never described in their works. And one of these encounters would change him forever, becoming a revelation. An encounter with a man who would become the living, breathing embodiment of his future prince. With the most brilliant, effective, and ruthless predator of the Italian Renaissance. A man named Cesare Borgia. The quiet Florentine office was empty. The humanist scholar, armed only with a pen, paper, and a sharp mind, was entering a cage of tigers. He did not yet know that this brilliant career would bring him both glory and humiliation, lead him to a torture chamber, and ultimately grant him an immortality for which he would pay with his reputation and his very name. 14 years. For 14 years, from 1498 to 1512, Niccolò Machiavelli was not just a civil servant. He was the nerve center of the Florentine Republic. He woke before dawn and went to bed long after midnight. His life became an endless stream of coded dispatches, secret reports, meeting minutes, and urgent diplomatic missions. He was a workaholic, obsessed with serving his city. Florence was his only true love, his religion. It was as an envoy of this republic that he traveled throughout Italy and half of Europe. But these were not pleasure trips. Each mission was like walking a knife's edge. Florence was rich but weak. It had no strong army of its own, relying on mercenaries who were as reliable as sand. Predators surrounded it on all sides, and Machiavelli, with no real force behind him, had to navigate between them using only his intellect, cunning, and eloquence. He was a master negotiator, capable of engaging in hours of empty conversation to extract tiny grains of valuable information. He learned to lie while looking kings in the eye, to flatter when necessary, and to threaten when he sensed an opponent's weakness. He visited the court of the French king Louis XII and observed with contempt the arrogance of the French, who considered Italians to be nothing more than scheming plotters. He negotiated with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian and saw his perpetual indecisiveness, which doomed all his grand plans. He met with the warrior Pope Julius II, who personally led troops into battle wearing armor, and understood that the head of the church could be a far more cruel and treacherous ruler than any secular monarch. All these encounters were invaluable lessons for him. Like a scientist, he collected examples of political folly, greed, wisdom, and cunning. But one meeting, one acquaintance, became a true shock, a revelation that forever changed his view of the nature of power. It was a meeting with a man whose name was spoken in Italy with a mixture of terror and admiration. A man named Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia, Duke of Valentino, was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. In an era when even the most notorious villains tried to cloak their misdeeds in a mask of piety, the Borgia family reveled in their depravity and cruelty. Rumors swirled of incest, poisoned wine, and political opponents whose bodies were fished out of the Tiber at night. But Cesare was not merely a debauched aristocrat. He was a genius of war and treachery. Using the boundless financial resources of his father, the Pope, and French military support, he swept through central Italy, through the region of Romagna, like a fiery whirlwind. This region was a conglomerate of small towns, each ruled by its own petty tyrant, who was constantly at war with his neighbors. Cesare decided to create his own unified and strong state there. And the methods he used were shocking, even for the world-weary Italy of his time. He would besiege a city, promise its ruler his life and freedom in exchange for surrender, and then, as soon as the gates opened, he would calmly have him strangled in front of everyone. He hired the best condottieri, and then, when they began to plot against him, he lured them all to peace negotiations in the town of Senigallia, where his men slaughtered them one by one. He could conquer a city, and then, to establish order, appoint his most brutal lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, as governor, who would drench the city in blood, hanging and executing all dissenters. And when order was restored and the people began to hate de Orco, Cesare, to present himself as a just ruler, would have Ramiro himself arrested, his body cut in half, and displayed in the main square for all to see. Machiavelli was sent to Cesare as a Florentine envoy and spent several months at his court. He observed him from a close distance, and he was captivated. Not by the cruelty, he had seen plenty of cruelty. He was captivated by the efficiency. While his native Florence, a republic, was mired in endless debates, hesitations, and indecision, Cesare acted. Swiftly, decisively, ruthlessly. He paid no attention to morality, religion, or his given word. For him, there was only one goal: to acquire and hold power. And anything that led to that goal was good. Anything that hindered it was bad. Machiavelli saw that Cesare could be not only cruel, but also generous. That he could be both a lion and a fox. He saw how he won the love of his soldiers and the common people, who were glad to be rid of petty tyrants and to have one strong, predictable ruler. In his dispatches to Florence, Machiavelli described with admiration his energy, his intellect, and his ability to inspire both fear and love simultaneously. He wrote, "This prince is splendid and magnificent, and in war he is so courageous that there is no great enterprise that does not seem small to him." It was while observing Cesare Borgia that Machiavelli formulated for himself the main, most terrifying law of politics. Politics cannot be judged by the laws of ordinary human morality. What is a sin for a common person, lying, murder, betrayal, can be not just permissible for a ruler, but a necessary tool for preserving the state and ensuring order. Politics is a separate, autonomous sphere with its own brutal rules. And anyone who tries to play this game with clean hands will inevitably lose to those who are not afraid to get their hands bloody. But then Machiavelli also saw the other side. He witnessed not only Cesare's dizzying rise, but also his swift, catastrophic fall. In 1503, his father, Pope Alexander VI, died suddenly, perhaps from malaria, or perhaps from poison intended for someone else. Overnight, Cesare lost his main resource. The new pope, Julius II, was a mortal enemy of the Borgia family. All of Cesare's enemies, whom he had not managed to kill, raised their heads. His empire, built on fear and force, crumbled like a house of cards. He was arrested, escaped, was caught again, and eventually died in some minor, inglorious skirmish in Spain. This was the second great lesson for Machiavelli. He understood that power based solely on luck and the strength of another person, in this case his father, the Pope, is not durable. A true prince must rely not on fortune, but on his own valor, virtù, his own army, and the support of his people. These lessons, the lessons of Cesare's effectiveness and the lessons of his fall, were deeply ingrained in the soul of the Florentine secretary. He returned to Florence a changed man. He was no longer just a civil servant. He was a political analyst, perhaps the first in history. He saw the world without illusions, and he was ready to apply his knowledge in practice to save his beloved but fragile republic. His main project would be the creation of Florence's own citizen army to replace unreliable mercenaries. He believed that only citizens fighting for their own land could be a truly reliable foundation for the state. He was at the peak of his career, respected, influential, full of plans. He did not know that the wheel of fortune, which he had observed so closely, was already preparing to crush him as well. In 1512, Spanish troops, allied with the Pope, approached Florence. The republic he loved and served so faithfully was about to fall, and his own life was about to turn into a nightmare. The year 1512 was fateful for Niccolò Machiavelli and his beloved Florentine Republic. The wheel of fortune, which he had so carefully studied in the lives of others, turned against him with a deafening screech. Pope Julius II, a sworn enemy of France, which was Florence's ally, formed a quote and unleashed his best troops on the Republic, the invincible Spanish infantry. Machiavelli, as secretary to the Council of Ten responsible for defense, found himself at the center of this storm. All his hopes rested on his creation, the citizen militia, the army he had painstakingly built over several years, believing that only armed citizens could protect their freedom. He shuttled between Florence and the army camp, organizing supplies, writing encouraging letters, and trying to instill confidence in the hearts of the commanders. The battle took place near the town of Prato, not far from Florence, and it was a catastrophe. The untrained Florentine militiamen, facing battle-hardened Spanish professionals for the first time, were swept away. They simply scattered and fled. The Spanish stormed Prato and carried out a horrific massacre to terrorize Florence. Thousands of civilians were killed. For Florence, this was the end. The Republic's government, seized by panic, capitulated. The city gates were opened, and after 18 years of exile, its former masters, the Medici family, backed by Spanish bayonets, returned in triumph. The Republic had fallen. For Machiavelli, this was not just a political disaster. It was the collapse of his life's work. For 14 years he had served the Republic faithfully, and now everything he believed in and worked for had been destroyed. But this was only the beginning of his personal hell. The new authorities, the Medici, immediately began a purge of the state apparatus. Machiavelli, as one of the most prominent and influential figures of the fallen regime, was among the first on the list. On November 7, 1512, he was dismissed from all his posts. His name was struck from the records. He was forbidden for a year to leave Florentine territory and even to enter the Palazzo della Signoria, the building that had been his second home for 14 years. Overnight, from one of the most influential men in the state, he became a despised outcast, unemployed and under constant surveillance. But the worst was yet to come. In February of the following year, 1513, an anti-Medici conspiracy was uncovered. It was a rather pathetic, poorly organized plot, but the new rulers decided to use it as a pretext for a show of force. Niccolò Machiavelli's name, most likely by mistake or malicious intent, appeared on a list of conspirators found on one of the organizers. He was arrested. The 43-year-old Machiavelli, an intellectual, a diplomat, a man accustomed to offices and libraries, was thrown into a damp, cold cell in the Bargello prison. He was accused of high treason, and in those days an accusation was tantamount to a conviction. To extract a confession, he was subjected to torture, the most common and agonizing torture of that time, known as strappado. They tied his hands behind his back, attached a heavy weight to the rope, and then hoisted him into the air, dislocating his arms from their sockets. He was held in this position, periodically dropped abruptly, and stopped just inches from the floor, causing excruciating, tearing pain throughout his body. He was tortured 6 times. 6 times he was raised and dropped, demanded to name his accomplices, and confess to a crime he most likely did not commit. And here, in this torture chamber, Machiavelli showed incredible courage. He did not break. He did not incriminate himself or others. In between torture sessions, he even wrote sonnets to his friends, full of dark gallows humor describing his suffering. He endured. His guilt was not proven. But he was not acquitted either. He remained in prison awaiting his fate. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. Pope Julius II died, and a Florentine, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, was elected as the new pope, taking the name Leo X. To celebrate this event, an amnesty was declared in Florence. Machiavelli, along with other political prisoners, was released. But he was a broken man, physically and mentally. After 22 days in prison and torture, he walked out a free man. But it was not freedom. He was ruined, humiliated, his political career destroyed. He was a man with no future. He had no choice but to retreat to his tiny, dilapidated estate in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, the place where he had spent his childhood. It was here, in this exile, far from the high politics that had been the meaning of his life, that his masterpiece was born. During the day, the former ambassador to royal courts, dressed in simple peasant clothes, would wander through the woods, play cards, and argue with the locals in the tavern. He had hit rock bottom. But every evening, he would return home to his modest study. He would wash away the dirt of the day and put on his finest formal clothes, the ones he once wore before kings and popes. And as he wrote in a famous letter to a friend, he would enter the ancient courts of ancient men. He would sit at his desk and converse with his only true friends, the historians and thinkers of antiquity. He read, he thought, and he wrote. He was obsessed with one question. Why? Why was Italy so weak and divided? Why had his beloved Florentine Republic fallen? Why was he, so intelligent and experienced, now on the sidelines of life? He sought answers. And in the process of this search, between July and December of 1513, in just a few months, in a feverish burst of creativity, he wrote a short book he initially called On Principalities. The world would come to know it as The Prince. This was not a philosophical treatise. It was a cry from the soul. It was a desperate attempt by an unemployed politician to prove his competence to the new rulers, the Medici. He was, in effect, saying to them, "Look, I know how power works. I know how to win it and how to keep it. I can be useful to you. I have spent 15 years studying the art of the state, and I have not wasted that time sleeping or playing games. Take me back into your service." He poured into this book all his bitter experience, all his knowledge, all his observations of Cesare Borgia and other rulers. He cast aside all the discussions of how things should be, which philosophers before him so cherished. He decided to write the brutal truth about how things are. He created not just a book, but an anatomical atlas of power, dissecting it with the cold precision of a surgeon, ignoring the screams and groans of morality. He did not yet know that this little book, written out of desperation in the countryside, would not get him his job back, but it would grant him immortality, an immortality for which he would be cursed for centuries. The little book called The Prince, written in the rural wilderness by a humiliated and exiled official, became an intellectual bomb whose shockwaves are still felt today. It was published only 5 years after Machiavelli's death, but instantly became a European bestseller and the greatest scandal of its era. The Catholic Church immediately placed it on the index of forbidden books, calling it a work written by the hand of the devil himself. Philosophers and moralists competed to see who could criticize it most harshly. But while they wrote their angry refutations, rulers, kings, and cardinals secretly read it to tatters by candlelight. Because Machiavelli had done the unthinkable, he had ripped all the masks off politics. Before him, all political philosophy, from Plato to his humanist contemporaries, was essentially a collection of good intentions. It described the ideal ruler: just, merciful, honest, pious. It spoke of how a state should be. Machiavelli contemptuously rejected this approach. He declared that there is a vast gulf between how people actually live and how they ought to live. And a ruler who ignores this gulf and governs by ideals will inevitably destroy both himself and his state. He proposed looking not at an imaginary reality, but at the effectual truth. And the truth, according to Machiavelli, was brutal and simple. People are by nature selfish, ungrateful, deceitful, and cowardly. Politics, therefore, is not the art of governing ideal citizens, but the art of managing these imperfect, flawed creatures. It is from this ruthless view of human nature that his most shocking pieces of advice emerge, the very ones that earned him his villainous reputation. It is better to be feared than loved. This phrase is the quintessence of his teaching. Machiavelli was not against a prince being loved, but he argued that love is a fickle and unreliable emotion. People love at their own discretion and will easily betray you in a time of crisis. Fear, however, depends solely on the will of the ruler, and fear is a much more reliable foundation for power. The key, he warned, is to ensure that fear does not turn into hatred. To avoid this, a prince need only refrain from seizing the property and women of his subjects. Men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony, he cynically remarked. A prince should not keep his word when it is to his disadvantage. For an era where the word of a knight or a king was considered sacred, this was unheard of audacity. Machiavelli argued that the world is full of liars, and he who always tries to be honest will become the victim of those unburdened by morality. A ruler must be like a centaur, half man, half beast. He must combine the strength of a lion to frighten away wolves, and the cunning of a fox to avoid traps. He must appear to be merciful, faithful, and pious, but be prepared at any moment to act in the complete opposite manner if the survival of the state demands it. Cruelty can be a virtue. Machiavelli distinguished between two types of cruelty: well used and badly used. Badly used cruelty consists of small, constant repressions that only embitter the people. Well-used cruelty, in his view, is that which is applied once, decisively and quickly, to crush dissent at its very beginning. He cited his idol, Cesare Borgia, as an example. Yes, he was cruel, but with his cruelty he brought peace and order to the ravaged Romagna, ending the endless slaughter carried out by petty barons. In contrast, his own Florentine Republic, which out of mercy was unwilling to use force, ultimately allowed the massacre at Prato, where thousands of innocents died. Whose cruelty was the greater evil in the end? Machiavelli asked. These and other pieces of advice created his image as an amoral monster. But was he one himself? The answer, surprisingly, is no. He dedicated his book to the Medici. He desperately tried to return to service, but he was never taken back. The new rulers did not trust him, seeing him as a dangerous republican. He was given only minor, humiliating tasks. He spent the rest of his life in poverty and obscurity, dedicating himself to literature. He wrote the brilliant Discourses on Livy, where, in contrast to The Prince, he passionately defended republican ideals, arguing that a republic is the best form of government because it is founded on freedom and law. He wrote the biting comedy The Mandrake, which became a hit and is still performed in theaters today. He wrote poetry and a history of Florence. He died in 1527 at the age of 58, a disappointed man who considered his life a failure. The epitaph on his tomb reads, "No praise can equal so great a name." He had no idea what deafening, albeit scandalous fame his little book, written out of desperation, would bring him. So who was he in the end? A villain or a misunderstood genius? The truth, as always, is more complex. Machiavelli was neither. He was a scientist, the first true political scientist in history. His goal was not to praise tyranny, but to create a science of power. Like a doctor, he described the symptoms and treatments of political diseases, even if those treatments were painful and unpleasant. He did not say that the world should be this way. He said that the world is this way, and if you want to survive in it, you must play by its rules. And herein lies his main, most important lesson, which many prefer to ignore. The Prince is not just a textbook for tyrants. It is also a textbook for the people. By revealing the secrets of power, Machiavelli, perhaps unintentionally, also armed those who wish to resist that power. He showed how tyrants think and act, and therefore he showed how to fight them. To defeat evil, one must first understand its nature. That is why his book is still relevant today. Because the nature of power has not changed. The scenery changes. We have skyscrapers instead of castles, nuclear missiles instead of crossbows. But people, their passions, their ambitions, their fears, they remain the same. And as long as politics exists, as long as the struggle for power continues, the name of Niccolò Machiavelli, that misunderstood genius from Florence, will be both cursed and studied, because he dared to tell us the truth, a cruel, unpleasant truth, but the truth nonetheless, a truth about ourselves.